Okay, good to be back with Mike Bromwich, former National Parks Warden and the man behind the book on the history of the Rhodesian Zimbabwe National Parks. But Mike, today we're going to talk about a couple of specific operations that the department was involved in. And we start off with the operation that was aimed at driving all the elephant back across the fence for the tsetse fence, driving the elephant north back into the Zambezi Valley. Can you just pick up the pieces there, Mike, and tell us a little bit about what it was about and the people that were involved in it and what was actually done?
Good afternoon, Hannes. Thank you very much for inviting me back again. Penduka and Nzhou, which is basically turn back or go back elephant, took place in 1967 and 1968 because basically it brought to an end the tsetse operations. I spent time with Paul Kutsia many years back, and Paul talked me through a lot of what went on in Penduka and Nzhou. Paul took over from Len Harvey, who you'll remember was killed by a lion in Sharpie. Paul was then became Warden Tsetse Ops, and Paul was called in 1967, sort of late 1967, to head office, where there was a meeting, and he was told that there was a great deal of urgency to rid the tsetse corridors. I believe at that stage there's 7, 8, maybe 9 corridors to rid them of elephant and buffalo, so that the tsetse hunters, or the magochas as they were called, could get in there and clear out the other host species and then make the land available for agriculture. They ruled out that hunting wasn't an option. They said, look, this is going to take far too long. Elephant get disturbed and they move, and then you start all over again, and it just goes on and on and on. So what Paul did was he suggested that they drive them out using an aircraft. Well, to say the least, this was absolutely poo-pooed. I mean, no, the critics just laughed at him. They just laughed, and they just said that's a physical impossibility. But Paul wasn't deterred, and he said, look, leave it to me, and I'll get the job done for you. One must remember that there were probably few people with Paul's experience as far as elephant hunting was concerned. He knew their habits exceptionally well. He knew how they could be moved, and one thing another. Anyway, Paul took his ideas and went and chatted to Angus Fraser, the department pilot, who was also in head office, and they put together a plan. They discussed it, and they realized that a certain amount of equipment would be required, that monies would be required, and vehicles and bits and pieces. Paul got hold of Don Aylward, who was a district commissioner of Gokwe, whose area the Sasami controlled hunting area, or tsetse area, fell under in Gokwe. And Don made available equipment. He carried expenses for labor. He cut the Pokwe strip out. He cleared the bush strip for the department aircraft and got everything organized. This was typical Don. And he also arranged for vehicles to be made available from CMED. We'll go into that in a moment. And Don was very, very capable and district commissioner. He moved from Gokwe, I believe, to Kariba, and a lot of the military chaps there, the salute scouts, other people remember Don from his days in Kariba. Just by the by, and just put on record, Don was awarded the military medal in Burma during the Second World War. The Penduka and Nzhou team comprised of, Norman Payne, let me just look at the names quickly. Norman Payne Sr., Clem Kutsia, Dave Scammell, Robin Hughes, John Stevens, and Bruce Cooper. Sadly, only Dave Scammell and John Stevens, are alive today. The rest have passed away. The drive began in late 1967. They operated from the Pokhui strip in the Sasami. Unfortunately, the drive was interrupted by the onset of the rains. But they did get a couple of drives in, and they started to perfect techniques, which basically were that
Mike, just let me interrupt there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think just explain the idea then was to use low-flying aircraft to drive the elephant out of the area, and then the fence would be put up very swiftly to stop them coming back. Was that the basic modus operandi? The
elephant were actually in the tsetse corridors. The fence was already up, and the objective was to drive them out of these corridors, out of the Sasami area, out of the corridor, and into the Sengwe, into the Sengwe area, into safety, that area, non-hunting area in the Sengwe, which later would become it was the Sengwe research station, the Sengwe area, and later the Charisa safari area and all that into that area anyway. Right. So that basically was it, to drive them out of the corridor, the tsetse area, and through the fence, which was up, and into the Sengwe area. Now, the modus operandi, as we were talking about, the aircraft would get up at first light, fly, locate a herd. Paul would then start, liaising with the ground crews and tell them, basically what was going on. Sorry, what I've actually admitted to mention was each morning before the plane took off, there would be a briefing, and the teams would be told, the area where Paul would be operating, and they would move, into positions in those areas, adjacent to them, to be prepared for the drive itself. So yeah, Paul would get up with Angus Fraser. They would fly. They would locate a herd of elephant. They would circle them and then begin pushing them in direction of the fence. Now this is a pretty delicate task, and there's a lot of sort of very want of a better word, hairy flying. They necessitated the aircraft swooping down onto the herds to push them. They would often try and turn back, and so the aircraft would maneuver the elephant, keep pushing them in the right direction. Where necessary, they would switch on a police siren that they had attached, and with this thing wailing like a banshee, they would get the elephant moving. They did a couple of drives in 1967 before the rains interrupted them. And so they basically knew what the techniques. In the end, it just got too muddy. Vehicles were sticking, and they were making no progress at all. There's a couple of interesting things happened in 1967, one of which was Arthur Jones. Now, I don't know how many people remember Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones was an American. He used to capture reptiles, and he was a great, he made quite a few movies. Anyway, Arthur Jones flew into the camp, into the Pokhui camp in his own helicopter, and he'd obviously got authority to do this. He would make the helicopter available for him, to provide that he could film, which was fine. A helicopter is far more maneuverable than a fixed wing. So they got up to one day and started to drive elephant. And I remember Paul talking to me, about this, and so I spent quite a lot of time with Paul after he left the department, and got to know him very, very well. They were flying very low, and they had the elephant. They were driving the elephant. The vehicles were in place, and they were flying low. And Paul noticed there was untoward maneuvering by Arthur Jones, and it became apparent that Arthur was looking for something really dramatic. We're trying to maneuver something dramatic to happen. Paul picked up on this, and because this flying wasn't what it should be, and there was some very, very heated words were spoken, and the chaps on the ground picked up on this, because they were close to the elephant, and the aircraft, the helicopter wasn't flying the patterns that they were used to, and they too picked up on this, which distressed them a lot. To cut quite a long story short, I think the drive actually was abandoned. Arthur Jones I think was actually requested to leave thereafter. Some people might remember Arthur Jones. He did a lot of flying, quite a lot of flying around the falls. He flew into the gorges there. He was a very competent helicopter pilot and a very competent cameraman. But that was Arthur Jones' story. Who came in there and to help them. You know, when things weren't going weren't going right, the sort of tempers flared and people got very agitated. Well, they did on an occasion. Paul located I don't know what you call them, a colony of mushrooms from the air with Angus, and he directed the chaps onto the ground and to go and pick these up. And they picked up a couple of these, you would say these aluminium bars. So we're told those big aluminium bars that were around. They filled a couple of those, and there's makawas, those big mushrooms, and everybody had a good feast. Well, the drive was because of the rains, and they got together again, I think June, July the next year. They carried on. Don Elwood was back on the scene. The Land Rovers, they came from CMED. I understand that Don Elwood had organized these. Well, these took a tremendous bashing in the thick bush, and I mean a tremendous bashing. The mud guards were dented, they were torn, springs were broken, and shock absorbers damaged badly. At the end of the operation, I don't quite know who, there was no volunteers to take these vehicles back to CMED. And I remember Richard Elwood talking to me about this, and Paul laughing, also laughing about the vehicles. Richard Elwood said there were certainly no volunteers to take them back, and he was Don Elwood's son, and he said they snuck the vehicles back to the CMED workshops after dark and left the keys there and left them. Obviously, Don was left to carry the can and to pour oil on very troubled waters, because CMED protocols. Vehicles were damaged anyway. There was accident reports, and it was a big story. But anyway, that was a story of the vehicles, and I think this is what happened after the first drive, and I think they might have got Army vehicles later to replace them. During the first drive as well, Dave Scammell was carrying a 470 Wesley Richards double, and there was a double discharge at rifle. One of the Land Rovers that he was in hit a log or a stump and bounced and came down very heavily. There was a double discharge from the rifle. It blew apart. And fortunately, nobody was injured. Well, that rifle just, was US. Now, I don't know if anybody is actually interested in the history of that rifle, but let me just briefly report. Strange how things happen. And department, in 1968, got permission from the ministry to bore the rifle. It was sold to Peter Lynham to best advantage. Now, Peter Lynham was a businessman in Sonoy, or Chinoy as it's now called, and Peter had it repaired and re-barreled. It had to get new barrels on. Wesley Richards did this, and the rifle was later sold. There was a gentleman, American hunter by the name of Peter Richardson, bought the rifle. He was very, very interested to know the history of this, and he would have got hold of Wesley Richards. Now, Wesley Richards kept immaculate records of all their weapons. They knew where they'd been and one thing or another. So they obviously told him that the rifle had been with the Rhodesian Parks Board, and he got hold of the chaps. And I remember getting emails in the early 2000s, probably 2005 thereabouts, from Dave Scammell, and I think John White was involved. And anyway, we got everybody together, and Dave got in touch with Peter Richardson and in America, and told him what the rifle, the history of the rifle, the story of the rifle, how it had been damaged, and who had been using the rifle and stuff like that. I mean, those weapons were treasured. So we knew everybody who'd handle them. So that's the story of that rifle. For interest's sake, the drives themselves, as I say, became fairly routine. They're up early in the morning, and they'd locate a herd. Techniques had been perfected. So they worked on the original techniques. They refined them a bit more. The bush was a lot easier. It was more open, and the vehicles didn't take quite as much bashing as they did before. So as the elephants, as the chaps will the viewers will see from the video and from the photographs, most of the work was done from the air, and the Land Rovers teams were brought in when the fence was reasonably close, and they were brought in to become like sheepdogs behind the elephant, and to make sure that no elephant broke back. And they just shepherded them quietly along and kept everybody moving. There was occasion when a calf was left behind, and the rangers couldn't leave it either, and so they stopped, picked it up, put it aboard, carried it forward, and they managed to drop that off later. And evidently it was reunited with its mother again. So the closer they got to the fence, the closer the Land Rovers came. Now, one must remember that the elephant would have known about the fence. It was a barrier, and they were very susceptible to these two barriers. They knew what they were. They were the barriers. I remember seeing a fence in Kyle that we took down. It took, I don't know, a year, 18 months for animals to move across it. So, once there's a barrier there, the animals are very, very wary of it. So the closer they got to the fence, the harder the elephants were pushed by Land Rovers, and by the chaps shouting, and the aircraft diving down and pushing. So the forward movement, actually became really a drive, and the animals were basically stampeded towards the fence. At this point in time, and when they knew where the fence was going to be breached, a vehicle would be dispatched to the fence, and the fence would be opened and the wires peeled back over a fairly large front, probably 100 meters. The fence would be peeled back, and the poles would be left up, and the teams would move. The vehicle team would move away from the fence itself. The closer they got, and I mean, these chaps were right on the tails of the elephant. I mean, within a matter of probably 5 yards behind the elephant, pushing them, using loud hailers, those bullhorns, and firing shotguns into the air and stuff like that. And they would basically stampede those elephants through the fence. And that basically was the story thereafter. The tsetse department, who would be kept in the background, their fencing crews was second to none. And the fence would be, the damaged poles would be, or broken poles would be replaced in a matter of hours, and the fence would be restrung. So it would become a barrier again, and the elephants wouldn't be allowed to break back in again. So that basically was the policy. 297 elephant in total were driven out of the corridors, and another 16 left of their own accord. So it was a first. They'd never used aircraft to drive again. Paul proved the skeptics and his critics completely wrong, and this actually just raised, the department, the sort of ability of the department, and the, I don't know what you would call it, the
reputation.
Nothing was too hard to do. They would do it. They would do any task, and it just it raised the esteem of the department, in the world eyes. It just raised them, higher and higher. It was another very great credit to the department and the chaps that worked in there. They were very confident, and as I say, it is just very sad that only Dave Scammell and John Stevens, are alive today. It's a great pity. So that basically, Hannes, is the story of the elephant drive.
Thanks for that. Let's go back in time. A lot of people have heard about it, but tell us about Operation Noah and Rupert Fothergill. Just a little bit of the background to the operation, what actually transpired.
Rupert was my first warden when I joined the department in 1966. He was then Warden Roving Control, Mashonaland South, based in head office, and he was the warden in charge of the 5 problem animal control units. I ran one of those units. Rupert was a man of great integrity. He was as straight as a die, and a very much a no-nonsense man. He was widely experienced, and he was always willing to help, the rangers. With him. And we spent a great deal of time with him every month when we came, and we handed our monthly reports, and we worked in the field for 26 days of the month, and then came into town for 5 days also, and handed in our monthly reports to him. Rupert's duties at the time when I knew him is, say, Warden Roving Control. He did control work in the Midlands area, dealing with various problems there, and also he dealt with issues in and around Harare. And there was one rather amusing case there. And I remember Rupert telling us, there was a couple of rangers, myself sitting in his office there, about the one call that he got. It was a lady who phoned into head office and said there was a strange creature in her garden she'd seen, or there was a strange creature in her garden.
Was this in Salisbury?
Yeah, in Salisbury, yes. And a strange creature, a wild animal, something she didn't, it was in her garden. And she wanted a member of Parks to go out and have a look. So Rupert, this was part and parcel of Rupert's responsibility to respond to these. He went out and got to her house and talked to her, and he said, well, where is this animal that you've seen or was in your garden? And she said, it's in the garden, and he said, well, whereabouts? And Rupert searched the garden, couldn't find anything. And she said, no, it's in the garden. It's still in the garden. And he said, well, can you describe it? And she described it. And what she described was actually a unicorn. Nothing Rupert could say or do would persuade her otherwise. Anyway, Rupert, being sort of a gentleman that he was, said they would attend to the matter, and he left. Well, these calls persisted, and in the end, Rupert just told the ladies on the switchboard, switchboard ladies, just listen, if you get another call from this lady, just please tell her that I'm not available. But there were these odd sort of calls, but and I would say Rupert was called out a couple of times a month to deal with various wildlife issues in and around Harare. Strange how wildlife in the suburbs comes into town. I mean, way later, it would have been just after independence. There were a couple of incidents of leopard in the suburbs of Harare and having to be dealt with. One was darted and the other one, unfortunately, had to be destroyed. But that'll just give you an idea. These boundaries are never really finite, and wildlife can come into the town. Now, that's basically my sort of story on sort of Rupert. He was an avid cine man as well, and which is actually very fortunate for us, for the historians, and fortunate in the fact that he worked with the 16mm camera, and which is transcribable in digital format, which is actually very, very format. And we are fortunate about this because without Rupert's films, we certainly wouldn't have half the records that we've got, visual records we've got of Operation Noah. So if we go from there, and we'll go through Operation Noah, and then go on to what Rupert did following Operation Noah, and how when he left the department, one thing and another. So if we look at history now, we look at history in 1951, which is actually 70 years ago. We look back. The International Hydrological Power Organization voted that or mooted that Kariba power plant, the hydroelectric dam, would be sited on Kariba and not on the Kafue scheme. The Zambians wanted to go onto the Kafue, but Kariba Gorge was chosen in preference. So that was in 1951. Federation was declared or formed in 1953. Godfrey Huggins, I think it was, became the first prime minister. In 1955, he made an announcement that work on Kariba was going to start. Building of the dam would commence. Now, it's very interesting to note then, we just got to also just think of what was happening on the wildlife side. We had, as we have noted previously, we had national parks who managed the national parks across the country. And in 1962, I think it was 1962, Archie Fraser formed the game department. It was a one-man, one-band. He was an incredible elephant hunter. He was also a poacher in his earlier days before he joined the game department, but Ian Nightons was the first member to come aboard. There was Rupert Fothergill was warden in charge. Tommy Orford, who many will know. Tommy Orford pestered, he came from UNETSI Ranch, he pestered the daylights out of the game department. till they took him on. Frank Junor was the biologist, a fish biologist. They will just tell you something about the department. The fish biologist. Frank was later very, very badly gored by buffalo on Operation No, which put an end to his working on Operation. It was a 425. He smashed that. Then Harvey was another ranger. He was another ranger, and Lend was killed in that line incident at Sharpie. There was Tinky Haslam, an assistant, and who later carried on his career with wildlife, became a warden, main camp, and later left the department. Peter Moore was also a temporary assistant, and he later became the senior ranger, I think, Lake Safety or Kariba. There was also Barry Ball. Barry Ball did a short spell, I think, on the lake itself and rescuing. He was later transferred back down to the Bike Bridge area where he did a lot of work down there. So that's basically the team. There were others that came and went on a temporary basis. The veterinary department chaps were attached to the team from time to time. One must remember that when Operation Noah started, which was December, I think, 1958, and it ran through to 1964. So for all intents and purposes, it ran for 5 years, we could say. Techniques, there was no precedent. Nobody had any experience of what to do. Everything had to be by trial and error. For people who know nothing about the operation, we just need to tell them what was happening, that the Zambezi was basically being dammed. And that's why the name Operation Noah. This was an operation designed to move wild animals out of the flooded area to safety on higher ground. Yeah, sorry, Hannes. Yes, my apologies. It goes back to the history when we were talking about, and the chaps in 1955 and there onwards began to plan for the effects of Lake Kariba, the flooding of Lake Kariba. And to this end, the Sabungwe hunting area was formulated. What they hoped was that hunting would move animals out, big game animals, out of the Sabungwe into higher ground, away from the lake when the lake was flooded. Matusadona and Chizarira game reserves were proclaimed as sanctuary areas and areas where animals could move. Matusadona was earmarked for one of the rescue areas where animals that were rescued would be taken. So basically what it was, Operation Noah, was to collect animals or to rescue animals from drowning that were in areas that were becoming flooded. And as the waters rose and the lake itself expanded, now the wall was closed in 1959, and the rescue operations started in late 58, December 58. As the waters sort of rose, so the lower areas became flooded, and animals started to move onto the higher ground, and islands were formed, and so the land became flooded. Now, the purpose, of the exercise was to get the animals off the land that was going to be flooded and inundated with the waters of the Zambezi. The rescue operations were techniques. There was nothing to work on. There was no precedent to look back and say, well, we can modify this, we can do that. It was all trial and error. Initially, a lot of animals were caught by hand, and where it was possible, they were driven into the water, caught by hand, put aboard a boat, tied up, taken across to Matusadona and released. This was actually very, very, pretty cumbersome. It was slow. The chap swam. There's photographs of Tinky Haslam holding an impala by the horns until one of the boats came along. There's photographs and video footage of a water buck being driven driven across into the lake. So it was all very much sort of trial and error as the sort of areas started to shrink and islands became more prominent. They brought game nets onto the island. Now this was the first use of game nets in capture. So first for the game department. One of the many firsts, in fact, indeed, that the national parks could claim. I think the most famous of these, if I can just scoot forward for a bit of time, one of the management techniques was Clem Coetzee's capture and immobilization and transport of entire elephant herds, which took place in the 90s, and moved elephant out of the drought-stricken Ghana Resort to other areas. So, but to go back to Kariba, then the nets were put up and animals were driven into the nets, and it was certainly a lot quicker, but it was a lot more stressful for the animals, and a lot of animals unfortunately did succumb to this. But they rescued a lot of animals, and it's dramatic footage. These animals into the nets. So that was one of the first, and so they did move along. I think in 1959, I think there was a total of 2,000 animals were rescued from the islands. Now it was also in 1959, in February, that the world press got to hear of this, and it was reported in one of the English Sunday papers of this rescue, and the headlines were very, very dramatic. And then I think two days later, Daily Mail posted a headline to the effect, Dunkirk of the animals, and that just set the whole place ablaze. I mean, remember that Rhodesia then still was a colony, and the international press were just flooded there. I mean, Reuters was the international sort of press collection information and distribution, and was a great integrity these chaps were, which is actually quite sad today when we realise that integrity of the press isn't what it should be. And although there are many good stories coming out of Zimbabwe today, the post-truth age is upon us, and stories are unfortunately twisted and to suit the agendas, and which actually affected Africa's wildlife actually very, very bad, done more harm than it's good. But to go back to Kariba.
Mike, I'm just going to jump in there. There's a funny story I remember hearing about Tommy Orford. When the press arrived, Tommy thought this was a good time to make himself a little bit more famous. And he leapt off a boat to rescue, I think it was a baboon, which looked to be drowning. Tommy swam up to this thing full of bravado, and the baboon then got busy with Tommy, and somebody had to jump in to save Tommy from the baboon, which was busy drowning Tommy Orford.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I really don't know that story, which it's highly possible knowing Tommy. Tommy loved these animals. He really did, and he was, some people referred to him there in Operation Noah, and I think it's been quoted in the book as Peter Pan. And but he was a delightful character, Tommy. I mean, his heart was in the right place, and he would do anything for his animals. He really would, and he was very, very gentle on them. But Tommy was quite a character, and it's, as I say, that story that you related is probably very, very true. With the press, all the reporting and the pressmen that came around, while Rhodesia, Zimbabwe was put on the map, it really, Operation Noah put Rhodesia on the map from a wildlife point of view, and our game department, our management techniques, it really sort of focused everybody on this country. An appeal went out for nylon stockings, which hit the international press as well, and hundreds of thousands of nylon stockings were shipped off to Harare, to the SPCA, ending up at Kariba, and they were used to tie up the legs of impala and all the animals that were captured. Ropes were causing a lot of damage from rope burns, and so nylon stockings were actually a boom. They were one off, you could slice them afterwards and just get rid of them, so they weren't an issue like it. And they say that appeal was just amazing, and we haven't ever seen a response anywhere else like the response the world made to in those days of need. So, we can be very thankful for that. And going to aid, carrying on with the aid story, international aid was offered to both sides of the Federation, to Northern Rhodesia and to Southern Rhodesia. The Southern Rhodesian government opted not to receive, not to take any aid. They were worried, and probably very rightly so, that the donors would demand a say in the decisions being made and what was being done. So, being afraid of interference, they said no, and the aid went to Zambia, and actually that was what kickstarted the Zambian side of the operation, got it going. Now, in 1960, the teams had to start dealing with the larger species of game, and I'm referring to black rhino here. And we were very, very fortunate that there were 2 or 3 doctors from Makerere University or College in Kenya, Dr. Tony Hawthorne and Dr. Tony Locke, that came onto the scene. Now, they had researched and refined the techniques of mobilization of rhino, and we were very, very fortunate to have the services. Rupert was very, very fortunate to have the services of these chaps. They came along and with their darting equipment, their capture gun, and the darts of 1960 was state of the art in those days. Their darts were, we looked at them, probably 20 centimeters long, maybe even longer. The drugs that they used, I think it was morphine sulfate and some other concoctions and stuff like that, they're no longer being used. The first rhino ever darted was darted in Rhodesia on Operation Noah and tagged, and that tag was actually later recovered. And there's a story about it in the National Parks book. What the team did is they darted the rhino went down, they'd rope it and then position it on a sleigh and tie it down on a sleigh. As I said, the drugs would keep it sedated as long as they would drag it then along, and some of the journeys were pretty hectic, and they would manpower the sleighs to the water's edge, and then drag the sleighs onto one of the boats, and then motor across to the mainland where they would offload the rhino. And on some occasions it was done on mainland, but 1 or 2 occasions it was done on the edge of the water. They would cut the ropes, administer antidote, and stand well clear. There are various photographs and films of the rhinos, sort of getting to their feet and being exceptionally bad-tempered and aggressive and attacking the boats. One of the boats was fairly badly gored, sort of hauled or by one of the rhinos, and chaps pushed up trees and that. So they in all, I think they moved 30-something rhino off the islands, and it went very, very successfully. All translocated to Matusadona. Elephants managed; they could swim, and they drove them off wherever possible. Into the waters, and drove them across to the shore. There was an incident. Ant bears were caught. You realize that not one living creature that they could. Everything that it needed to be rescued, the team would take care of. There are magnificent photographs of Rupert with parrots. Rescuing parrots. Trees that would have been drowned, taking parrots out of nests and rearing them, taking them to safety. Snakes, boomslangs, Frank Juno caught. There were marmos caught. Honey badgers were caught, and that was a pretty precarious. Ant bears, hares, every little creature that needed to be rescued. And to rescue, they would capture. In total, I think under 5,000 animals were rescued. 1 lioness was caught. Lions can also swim. She was also very, very aggressive, and nobody was injured in that. There was a lot of glamour attached to the operation, but people didn't realize the rigors and the hardships that the chaps enjoyed. The temperatures in the valley, as you're aware of, during the summer months, and it's hot for most of the year down there. Temperatures went to the mid and high 40s. We're talking 110 degrees Fahrenheit upwards, and so it was very, very harsh living. There were no home comforts, and many, I would think, there were many bruised bodies and that went to bed at night. They endured, a lot of hardships for the work they were doing and for the love of the animals and the work they were carrying out. We can only salute the chaps that took part in this. And the black team, California, Rupert's scouts, the other scouts and the laborers, they did a magnificent job. And one can never downplay the efforts of these chaps. They really worked hard. Rupert was very, very conscious of the welfare of animals, and any animal that drowned or died, they slit the insides and slit it open and let it sink to the bottom of the lake. This was to prevent any, and quite rightly so, any undue, sort of care being taken of animals that, they might be used for meat afterwards. This was not allowed, and the rations were provided for them. So it just gives you an idea of, the care that the chaps went to look after the wildlife and the rescue operations. So the operation came to an end in 1964, with nearly 5,000 animals being rescued. I think some 1,600 were rescued on the other side, and on the northern Rhodesian or Zambian side, and the operation came to a close. On the Kariba Heights, a plinth was later put up, a memorial listing all the animals that were rescued and giving tribute to the chaps that actually worked on it. So basically, Hannes, that is the story of Operation Noah. And I don't know whether you've got any further questions on Operation Noah that I can actually fill in. I did follow this, I think a lot of people followed this in the press at the time. There was, a lot of film footage. The Southern Rhodesian governments put a lot of film footage out, and so did the international press. And I think Gaumont British News at the time was still functioning, and you used to see those clips in the cinemas, from time to time when they came out. So go back to Rupert Fothergill. Basically, immediately after Operation Noah came to an end, Rupert was sent off to the Sezemba area, Sezemba in the Binga area. Now, Sezemba is basically between Tsetse and the Sengwe River. Now, there was a lot of black rhino in that area, and it was an area that had been cleared and allocated for resettlement for displaced Penduka people, and the rhino, by agreement, had to be moved out. So Rupert was dispatched there with his team to translocate, to capture and to translocate the rhino from Sezemba. Rupert they were darting rhino. Now nobody exactly knows how, what actually happened to Rupert. The reports that I received and was that something obviously went wrong with the rhino that had been tranquilized, and Rupert was very, very badly gored, and I mean critically gored.